Well, good afternoon, and thank you to everyone joining us here and virtually at the wonderful National Press Club. We've just heard, unfortunately, that Congressman Scott Peters will be unable to join. He's having a very similar conversation just down the street at the markup, which is still going. He sends his apologies and thanks everyone for joining this important discussion. On behalf of him, my distinguished colleagues here, thank you for joining today's event. My name is John Stanford. I'm the Executive Director of Incubate, the national coalition that brings the perspective of life science venture capital to Washington. The policy debate over drug pricing has been brewing for many years. Yet for much of that time, the voice of those who are at the heart of that innovation has been absent here in Washington. Incubate has been working to change that. And it's in that vein that we convene today's event, as all of our members are sounding the alarm over the effort to impose price controls in the pharmaceutical market. Today, we have some of the nation's most notable early-stage life science investors, two CEOs of breakthrough biomedical companies, and an outspoken patient advocate. Their perspective comes on the heels of a letter signed by more than 500 biotechnology executives, investors, NIH-funded academic researchers, and patient advocates, all warning that the Democrats' leading drug plan, which is a principal component of the broader reconciliation package, will, quote, immediately halt private funding of drug discovery and development. The signers include over 150 investors, whose funds have over $200 billion invested in drug development and the life sciences. These investors are the ones who fund research and development. Just the few we have here today have over $10 billion invested in life science companies. That letter, along with reports from Incubate's Policy Lab, are available for today's attendees. Our reports, including two coming out later this month, capture the perspective of the life science investment community, as well as share the views of leading academics and health policy experts about flaws in the Congressional Budget Office's scoring of H.R. 3. With that backdrop, we're gathered here today to speak with one message. If price controls are enacted, the life sciences investment equation will no longer justify investment in research and development. Investment won't just be reduced, it will drop off a cliff. This would not only trigger a crisis for all of America's biotechnology companies and the thousands of well-paying jobs they provide, but it would let down patients across the world who are desperately waiting for new treatments and cures. Those patients are not elsewhere. When we say patients, we mean all of us. To be clear, we stand here today not opposed to measures that would promote true insurance negotiation with competing companies, but to the one feature of H.R. 3 that would redefine the word negotiation to mean government control of prices on any successful medicine. And we do oppose that. I'd now like to welcome today's speakers. After each guest shares brief perspectives, we'll have a discussion and hopefully hear a lot from you, both of those of you here in person today and those of you attending virtually. So please, think of your questions. I'll turn it over first to investor Peter Kolchinsky from RA Capital. Peter is one of the authors of the letter I mentioned, a scientist by training, and a leader in the life science community. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and John and Incubate for setting up today's event. I'm Peter Kolchinsky, a co-founder and managing partner at RA Capital Management. In just the past 12 months, our team has funded over 100 companies developing novel medicines and life science technologies. I'd like to focus my remarks on what would happen to this R&D if H.R. 3 or a similar policy that mandates dramatic price reductions on successful drugs were implemented. Fundamentally, if the government can pick any arbitrarily low price it wants and prevent a company from saying no by threatening it with a ruinous 95% tax, then I could not justify any biomedical R&D investment to my investors. In other words, we would expect a near total collapse of R&D funding. Fund managers have a fiduciary duty to only direct capital to R&D projects with positive expected returns. I can personally donate to good causes, and I do, but I'm not allowed to invest anyone else's money unless I can make the case to them that there is a positive expected return. That's a rule. The greater the risk, the greater the potential future earnings need to be to justify funding the project. And real breakthroughs in medicine require us to take big risks. Investors calibrate their future revenue expectations in large part by watching how government and commercial insurance plans value and pay for today's new drugs. That's what we mean when we refer to market-based pricing. So if the government declares that investors can no longer expect market-based pricing for today's therapies or tomorrow's, we can no longer have anything to base return expectations on. We just know that they will be arbitrarily lower than they are today, and so we can't justify investing in tomorrow's breakthroughs. The problems most worth solving are still there because they are hard and expensive to solve. We'll fund dozens of programs only to see most fail. That's okay, as long as eventually some succeed and earn a high enough reward to have made the whole portfolio worth funding, not just that one drug. But Congress wants to wait until we funded all those programs and only after they see which ones are the successes, they want to chop them down. That's not going to inspire any investment. Congress says that when setting price, it will take into account what it costs to develop that one drug. Again, overlooking that what matters is what it costs to pursue a whole portfolio of projects just so that one drug could rise to the top. When it comes to asking investors to fund risky R&D, there is one basic rule. If no one believes that the portfolio will generate a positive return, they don't invest. This is exactly why we already have relatively little research into novel antibiotics. Sadly, it doesn't matter how much society needs a medicine. What matters is what investors believe society will pay for it. If government price controls kill that belief in positive returns, it will force fund managers like me to stop investing into drug R&D. There will be essentially no new drugs. Not 59 fewer like the CBO miscalculated. I'm talking about a near total defunding of new drug development, and so virtually no new medicines. That being said, I also want to tell you that as I stand here, my team is making new investments in new companies. Every week brings new ideas and new inspiration. Why would we do that if price controls are such a deterrent to R&D? Because I'm optimistic that as Congress considers the magnitude of destruction H.R. 3-like price controls would inflict on the biomedical ecosystem, the tremendous loss of jobs and loss of hope in better medicines, I'm optimistic that Congress will make a different decision. I'm optimistic that Congress will solve affordability for patients by lowering what insurance plans are allowed to charge them out of pocket. And to get better value for medicines, I'm optimistic that instead of killing biomedical R&D by passing price controls on new drugs, Congress will see the merit and savings in ensuring that all drugs go generic without undue delay. Congress could generate large savings right now by focusing on the drugs that should have already gone generic, yes, including insulin and Humira. That would not reduce incentives to develop new drugs. I'm optimistic that we'll be heard. I very much hope that we will be believed. Either way, the outcome of price controls isn't a matter of belief. The market doesn't bend to our beliefs about how it works, but when we understand how it works, we can inspire it to good purpose. I'll now turn over the podium to my good friend and colleague, JF.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. So my name is Jean-François Formula. I'm a partner at Atlas Venture. Our team has started over 200 companies, biotech companies, the past 25 years. Many of which now are public or they've been acquired, and many of them have brought important drugs to patients. One of our young companies just generated the first positive in vivo data for gene editing. Just to give you an example, we had to raise about $1 billion of capital just for that phase 1 experiment, which is very early in clinical development. We'll probably need another couple of $1 billion to bring that to market. I trained in intensive care medicine in Paris in the 80s. And I came to in the US to the early 90s to join the pharmaceutical companies. After a couple of years, I wanted to do something a bit more exciting and focus on innovation. And I joined Atlas Venture to build the life sciences franchise. As you may have noticed, most of us are actually MDs or PhDs, as many of our colleagues in the industry. which is a very important point to understand. And you should also know that we all have a passion for medicine and science, without which you cannot succeed in our industry. While we enjoy the potential reward of investing, we also equally enjoy the successes of medical and scientific breakthrough, which drives many of us. We are here because the suppression of the fundamental market mechanism to finance innovation is a mistake. We are not here to express threat about what we want to do in terms of investing, whether we'll invest or not, because we're annoyed or frustrated. So it's totally out of our control, as Peter just said. And now, let me tell you why, if I can turn the page. What we want to do as individuals in terms of investing doesn't matter. We simply won't have the capital to do that. Our investors are pension funds, endowments, foundations, and they will reallocate the capital elsewhere. Capital flows to the sector and project with the best risk-adjusted return, and we cannot deny those market forces. All of us can be frustrated with that once in a while. People refer to the market, and the market is all powerful. The market is gravity. There is nothing we can do about it. We have to deal with it as investors. We too have to go raise money. It's not like the money is coming, is sitting in a bank somewhere, and we can take as much as we want and we invest it when we like it or not. We have to go raise money from those investors. And for example, those pension funds, they have to pay pension to many citizens around the country, and they cannot invest if they don't understand the potential for return. So if it's no longer possible to predict return, capital will flow out of the sector. This will affect both private, public companies, large and small companies. Jobs will be lost, and the tremendous US leadership we've built in this industry will be impaired. More importantly, patients will pay the ultimate price, and Gunnar, I think, will talk about that, because they will no longer have access to the next wave of innovation. It is important to note that we're not against competition, as Peter mentioned, or negotiation. On the contrary, we advocate competition, and older drugs that have run through their patent life or exclusivity period should go generic without exception, which is not the case today, as you probably know. We fully support enforcement of the Hatch-Waxman Act, which was a grand bargain that enables the US to develop a primary position in the world in this industry. And that also enables the current surge of innovation that we're seeing in the US and globally. In conclusion, price control on innovative novel drugs, and again, I emphasize that as Peter did, price control on innovative novel drugs that have not had a chance to generate returns yet for their investor is just bad policy. It's a mistake. It might be good politics, but it's bad policy. And it also ignores 90% of the rest of the healthcare cost and dysfunction to uniquely single out innovation and potentially destroy it. Thank you. And with that, my colleague Arjun.
Thank you, JF. Thank you, firstly, for all being here. My name is Arjun Goyal, and I'm one of the co-founders and managing directors at Vita Ventures. Our mission at Vita is to create and invest in biopharmaceutical R&D-driven companies that are focused on developing transformative therapeutics for patients, both here in the US and globally. And our group, importantly, comprises of physicians and scientists who've come from all over the world, myself included, to fulfill this mission. If this bill is passed, those who invest, as you've heard, those who invest in our funds will direct their capital away from the biotech sector and away from venture capitalists who are putting together companies that are funding innovative R&D. More than 50% of FDA-approved medicines today have their start in private venture-backed companies here in the US, and that percentage is just increasing. These companies are focused on groundbreaking therapies in cancer, in genetic diseases, and many other scourges. Ultimately, as you've heard, patients will lose out both here in the US and globally. In addition to this, larger pharmaceutical companies would also reallocate their capital away from research and development projects to other projects where they can deliver a higher rate of return on their invested capital as per the demands of their shareholders. The US will forfeit its global leadership in this industry at a moment in time when this industry of biomedical research is going through a revolution, a golden era in this industry globally. And that is really because of the investment of both private and public capital markets in the life sciences industry here in the US over the last 20, 25 years. In addition, both the biotech and both the large pharmaceutical and biotech industries employ many thousands of R&D professionals and scientists here in the US, and those jobs will be imperiled, particularly in states like Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, California, and New Jersey. Simply put, we know how this ends. I hope lawmakers hear us and decide not to take us down this path. To close the investor perspective, we have a leading general counsel from RA Capital, Sarah Reed.
Hello, my name's Sarah Reed. I'm not a scientist, I am a lawyer, but I've worked in the in-house investment industry for about 2 decades. A few years and many dozens of deals into that in-house investment career, I put together a coalition of the leading attorneys across the nation who specialize in financing venture capital startups to put together a standard set of documents that startup companies could use to paper their financing transactions. The goal was to dramatically reduce the time and legal cost for startups to raise money. And we succeeded greatly in that goal. Thousands of companies are financed every year using those standard set of documents that are freely available on the internet. Every year we have to get together as a group and review those documents to see what changes, if any, might need to be made in response to changes in law or new Delaware case law. Never before, though, have we had to deal with threatened legislation which would eviscerate the fundamental economic assumptions underlying our investments. That's a new drafting challenge for lawyers like me. But it's a challenge we have to rise to meet, because fundamentally, as a lawyer, my job is about anticipating the problems that might arise and drafting a solution preemptively and proactively into the documents. So we're at a place right now in the legal industry where we just can't keep on papering those financing transactions in the same way we have historically. It's as if we see a comet hurtling towards us, we can't just shrug our shoulders and say, well, I hope it doesn't hit us. Let's just carry on as usual. The same way that now for a lawyer, if I'm drafting a contract, it's just negligent for me not to include pandemic in the list of act of God clauses, along with, tornado, earthquake, riot. I mean, I know now, pandemic, it's a real possibility. I have to include it. Accordingly, it would be negligent not to include in our financing contracts an out for the investors if anything like H.R. 3 in its current incarnation passes. It would spearly be legal malpractice not to address that existential legal risk. I spearhead a group of in-house counsel at life science investment firms. There are about 80 of us. In fact, they're on a Zoom call right now. And we're discussing how we're going to draft what would be, in essence, a legal escape hatch that would allow firms like ours to cease investing more money and to pull back the money that we've already funded if H.R. 3 is passed in anything close to its current form. Thank you. I'll now turn the podium over mercifully again to two scientists and entrepreneurs, leaders of very promising, exciting biotech companies. Thank you. Joanne Katz. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Joanne Katz. I'm the CEO of Janana Therapeutics. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time today to listen to the perspective of small biotech companies on this issue. As a member of the biotech executive community, I would like to emphasize just how important venture funding is in the arduous, high-risk process of bringing new medicines to patients. At Janana Therapeutics, we have created a next-generation chemoproteomic platform that allows us now to drug highly compelling but traditionally hard-to-drug targets. As a result of this innovation, we are now in a position to develop first-in-class medicines to treat a range of diseases like rare diseases like PKU, autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. Today, we have reason to hope our work will make a difference for patients. Someday, if we successfully develop a drug, I have to count on insurance plans valuing it enough to make it available to patients. I tell my investors that while our drug is branded, it will generate enough profits for them to have made the risks they took worthwhile. And eventually, our drug will go generic, continuing to help patients while costing little and saving society on hospitalization and other costs forever. That's the grand bargain. However, if H.R. 3 passes and Congress redefines the word negotiation to no longer mean real negotiation, our critical funding from venture capitalists will dry up, along with our potential to develop urgently needed new treatment options. As a result, we will all lose hope of having better medicines tomorrow than we have today. We will all face suffering and greater costs from diseases that our research could have averted. That is senseless. I am counting on Congress to make the right decision. Thank you very much, and I'll now turn it over to Axel.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. My name is Axel Huus. I'm a physician, a scientist, and the CEO of Scorpion Therapeutics. At Scorpion, we develop precision medicines for cancer patients based on the latest innovation in chemistry, target biology, and computational methods. Our expert team is moving with urgency to provide the next generation of medicines to improve outcomes for patients with presently untreatable or treatment-resistant disease and give them more time with their families. However, like others, as you have heard, we are concerned that the legislation of H.R. 3 would disincentivize investment in specialized companies like Scorpion. Innovation in drug development is hard. Especially in cancer, progress is incremental and depends on several steps of innovation to be able to offer the desired clinical improvements for our patients. After all, the process of bringing a new treatment from the laboratory to the market costs the equivalent of $2.6 billion. And given that a fair share of initially promising experimental medicines fail to become drugs, makes it harder for investors and depend on a portfolio to deliver winners, successful drugs, to pay for the funding that was invested in the entire portfolio. The passage of price controls would append these critical incentives and make it fundamentally impossible for investors to secure a return, causing them to leave the sector. Consequently, we simply won't have the capital to continue our research and to address unmet needs in the cancer treatment landscape. I think it is also very important to hear the voice of a patient or a patient advocate. So I'm now welcoming Gunnar Esiason to the stage to provide that perspective.
Thanks, Axel. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm grateful for your time. My name is Gunnar Esiason. I am a rare disease patient leader living with cystic fibrosis, and I have witnessed firsthand the benefits of the United States' top-tier life science ecosystem. I'm a patient advocate with our family's nonprofit, the Boomer Esiason Foundation, which has raised $160 million in the fight against cystic fibrosis since I was diagnosed in 1993. I'm alive today precisely because of the market opportunity present in drug discovery and development. For the better part of my early 20s, I was teetering on the brink of end-stage illness. The thing that got me through my worst days, when I was bouncing in and out of the hospital or operating room every couple of weeks or sometimes even more frequently, was the idea that somebody, somewhere, was working on something. And that's where people like those sitting here today, early stage life science investors, biotechnology executives, that's where they stepped in. That's where they poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the development of breakthrough medications. We, patients, are keenly aware of the drugs in our respective pipelines. Our hope is anchored to them. The idea that our current therapies will only be improved upon and that there could be innovations we haven't even thought of yet affords patients like me and those living with a range of chronic conditions even more hope. But if H.R. 3 is passed, we will sacrifice the incentive structure underlying improvements to our current medications and cures for future patients. When the government can simply undercut the market prices, investors will not have the financial certainty needed to continue funding high-risk research and development ventures. I am the output of that high-risk research. I have my drug, but it's about the next generation of drugs, the next drugs for the next group of patients. For so many patients living with unmet medical needs, advancing this kind of legislation could prove a life sentence. Thank you, and I'll hand it back to John.
Connor, thank you for that perspective. Amid this increasingly rancorous debate, it's critical that we always remember the patient and that we ourselves all someday will be patients. We're so glad that you, Joanne, and Axel could join these investors for today's event. I'd now like to open the discussion to our attendees from the media. I'd ask that you identify your outlet, and if attending in person, continue standing near your chair. We have microphones for everyone to use, and if you'd like to direct your question to a specific speaker, please do, though I will encourage multiple speakers to address it. So with that, happy to open the floor for any questions. Yeah, in the back. And those attending virtually, you can submit questions online that will be read out here.
Hi, this is Robert King with Fierce Healthcare and Fierce Pharma. I wanted to ask the panel about the new legislation that was proposed by Rep. Peters, who was supposed to be here, that gives a narrower negotiation of for Medicare drugs on Part B that would not apply those prices to private plans, but keeps some elements of H.R. 3. Are you all opposed to any negotiation mechanism at all, I guess?
Thank you. That's a really good question. The Scott Peters bill has some really great elements in it. It dramatically lowers what insurance plans can charge patients out of pocket, setting annual caps. But please note that it's actually more like monthly caps. It's smoothed out over the year. That's important. So that's clearly a thoughtful proposal. And then when it comes to drug prices, the legislation is really aimed to reduce what America pays for older drugs. We have absolutely no issue. In fact, we propose ourselves that the government fix some of the market failures that continue to allow old drugs to garner rewards as if they were new ones. That's not supposed to happen. We invent these drugs with the expectation of finite rewards, and then we expect them to become inexpensive public goods. In the past, generic competition achieved that. But increasingly, as drugs have become more complicated and harder to copy, it's become more difficult to achieve that kind of end to the reward period through generic or now biosimilar competition. And it's time for the government to come up with other solutions. And what you see there in the Peters bill is an example of such a solution.
Yeah, just to add to that, to be clear, we are only concerned about novel drugs, innovative novel drugs, for whatever period of exclusivity has been negotiated, and I'm sure will continue to be negotiated with government. Older drugs should go generic or should have essentially some kind of stronger price negotiation that bring into values that is palatable to the patient and the government.
I would actually, you did ask the question, are we against negotiation? We're not. We count on negotiation, but the true kind of negotiation that exists when there are competing companies selling similar enough products that a customer can say, I'll go with whoever gives me the best price. And there's a lot of that kind of competition in the industry. And we count that when we fund a company that's working on a drug and it's competing with other companies, we hope our company will be first and best. But we also know that in case it's not, let's say it's third to market, we know that our company will be able to offer a lower price and win some market share for its efforts. That's reassuring to us. So we do not want a system where a company can't come in, a little late to the game and offer a lower price and win market share. All right, so we are for negotiation. You see a fair bit of negotiation in Part D, and there could be more room for true negotiation in Part B. But redefining the word negotiation to mean we tell you what price we're willing to pay, and then we force you to accept that, that's just a euphemism. That's not actual negotiation.
Yeah, as for competition, not only do we accept it, but we promote it. The risk for us, the risk we're willing to assume, is not only the risk of failure, but it's also the risk of technology obsolescence. There is so much innovation right now that we actually can no longer guarantee that the novel drugs we bring to market, even if we're technically successful, will be able to actually be profitable for the 10 to 12 years or whatever patent lives they have, because the pace of innovation is so quick right now that you will see true competition among the innovative drug. So we're shifting the paradigm from the old paradigm of pharma 20 years ago, where everybody was selling the same drug, raising the price, innovation was occurring every decade or so. Now innovation is occurring every quarter.
I'll just chime in. I think that is a perfectly good point, and one possibly for further discussion, that I think there's some assumption amongst policymakers that medicines are going to live out their exclusivities in patent terms. And I think that's a tremendous point, that a better therapy is coming along at such a faster pace that our investors here and our biotech executives have to factor in. They're going to face a competitor even with a patent protection. And as you're hearing from them, they're factoring that in. To your question, by the way, Incubate's issuing its statement of support. Unfortunately, in preparation for this event, we haven't made it public yet. But we do believe the Peters bill does take this conversation in the right direction and shows that they've been listening to the voices of people like here on the stage, both patients, investors, and biotech executives.
John, we have a question from Joyce Frieden with MedPage Today. Several of the speakers mentioned allowing older drugs to go generic, but that alone may not be enough to lower prices for the many people who can't afford some of the really expensive biologics whose prices can go into 6 and even 7 figures. Are there any other policies you would support to lower drug prices? What about fixing issues with patent thickets and pay-for delay?
So we have to do all we can to win insurance reform for patients. Nothing in our healthcare system is affordable without proper insurance. So we, in the letter that we wrote for which there's so many co-signers in our statements here today, we urge Congress to indeed reform insurance and reduce what insurance plans are even allowed to charge patients out of pocket for any appropriately prescribed medication. It's not clear to me why somebody with a clear diagnosis of diabetes should have to pay even $5 as a copay for their insulin. What exactly is that insurance plan nudging that patient to do when it's clear as day that that is the right drug for them? So this notion of skin in the game and we don't want patients to overutilize drugs, who, seeks out a cancer drug when they don't have cancer? So our system right now, I think, is very poorly designed to serve patients. To be fair, a lot of people get a lot of benefit from their insurance, but it's the people that are left behind that we're fighting for. That being said, even if we had insurance reform that dramatically lowered out-of-pocket costs for patients, and if the acronym OOP came to stand for out of premium, and we were all now paying for these medicines, it would still be wrong for us to be collectively paying high prices for old drugs. That's not the contract. That's not how the system's intended to work. For decades, we have invested with a full expectation that the products our companies launch will go generic after typically 10 to 15 years. And the fact that patent gaming has emerged as a mechanism for extracting more rent from society, then it would do no harm to the innovation sector to end that rent seeking. We're in it for the finite mortgages, not for the long-term rents that some companies have managed to extract. Jeff?
But to the specific question about, is there a mechanism to lower the cost or to make drugs, innovative drugs, more affordable before they've essentially outlived their exclusivity period? There is already such mechanism. It's called the market. We're facing tremendous headwind from the insurance company to get coverage for innovative medicine. And as you probably know, there is a lot of initiative around value pricing, which is essentially adjudicating the value of that drug. If you look back at HCV, the Gilead drugs that cured HCV, that drug is actually now, I think it's generic or close to generic, or the cost has decreased significantly. The saving from curing HCV are accruing to society for perpetuity. It's billions of dollars a year. Hatch-Waxman was a grand bargain, it works, but there was, even before, you could have negotiated the tremendous value that curing HCV brings. And the insurance company are doing that, and a lot of the innovative companies, you look at a company like Alnylam, they have a value-based pricing, which is looking at the true value that the drug introduced. So there is a way to have a fair and competitive price that actually brings value. The question is, how do we reform the healthcare system to make sure that that value accrues to both the patient and the government agencies?
And I would just add that I think in this debate, as it moves forward, and hopefully in a more productive fashion to that question, that insurance reforms are put on the table. They have been oddly absent in the conversations that Congress is having right now. But all of those issues just described to them are payer issues, and yet a lot of those issues aren't being discussed in great depth today. But I do think that is what a patient pays at the pharmacy is tied to the manner in which they're covered and their health care is provided. And so to explicitly focus on one drug price or the concept of drug pricing is missing how our entire insurance industry and healthcare industry operates.
By the way, heart transplant is 1.4 million a year. I'd like to hear the same question as to how we make those procedures more affordable for patients with less copay, or with some copay, which is not the case for a lot of procedures.
Yeah. I think we got to bring the mic over.
I'm Kathy Kelly with the Pink Sheet. Just on that question of value, I was wondering about your thoughts on some kind of a national health technology assessment program or something like that that would come up with some uniform way of defining value.
So that's a really great question. And forgive me, this is is pretty philosophical, but the math that people do to try to figure out what is the exact value of a new product is really nascent math. It's very poorly developed, and the economists that really are at the heart of that would say this is just our attempt to approximate what we think matters to people, what we think, how we think they might value something. But when you look at the way that the math, the cost-effectiveness math, has been done by those countries that actually use it for price setting and price negotiation, what you realize is it's not really truth-seeking math. It's math that willfully ignores, for example, that drugs go generic. They pretend that a drug's initial price will be that price forever. Well, that would be like pretending that your mortgage payments for your home never end. Well, that's wrong. People know that a mortgage is more worth paying than rent precisely because mortgages end. But that doesn't serve their goals. So they pretend, using oversimplified math, that the drugs will cost that price forever. They ignore, for example, that a drug not only serves the patient, but alleviates that patient's entire family and caregivers of all the burden of having to respond and worry, about that disease. If you were to use that math to ask, what is the value of drugs to treat smallpox, which the American government pays for and stockpiles just in case, the math breaks down because there's a cost, several $100 million a year. But when you divide by the number of QALYs that we generate, by treating people, they say, well, but nobody's treated. Nobody actually gets those drugs. So you're dividing several $100 million a year by what, 0? So it's infinitely expensive. So I guess it's not worth it. Yet all of us would say, what do you mean it's not worth it? It's reassuring to us. And they say, we don't know what you mean. We do not factor reassurance into our math. And so I think it would be very interesting to fund a truth-seeking IHTA, as you call it, and that has been proposed. And I would be very supportive of an independent organization like that attempted to see the true value of these innovations. And I'm not at all fearful of what that math would show, because I know that when you add in all the different values that conventional math ignores, you would discover that these products, like so many examples of innovation, are worth far more than their market prices. Economists have a term for that extra value that society gets above what those products cost. It's called a consumer surplus. And you can feel it in the way that there are millions of people who take generic heart medications, statins, barely costs anything. It keeps them out of hospitals. They don't need surgery, right? But nobody talks about them anymore. We just take that for granted. Well, that's consumer surplus. It makes life better.
I want to tag in Gunnar here.
Yeah, thanks, John. I definitely want to echo what Peter is saying. I think that the way that health technology assessments are currently run inside the United States or even outside do not fairly understand what a patient goes through on a daily basis, right? The drug that I take, the drug that changed my life, Trikafta, still not available in Canada, still not available in Australia. But what it did for me is so substantial that it's hard for me to articulate, right? When I graduated college in 2013, I was planning to go to law school. That was what I wanted to do. And no offense to the attorney here, I can't believe I actually wanted to do that. But my cystic fibrosis took that from me, right? I was so unbelievably sick that getting from the bedroom to the bathroom in the morning was a success if I could do it. I was in and out of the hospital. I was in and out of interventional radiology. I was in and out of any single encounter that you can possibly imagine. That's what my life looked like. 3 pills every single day since 2018, middle of 2018, has given me an MBA. It has given me a marriage. It has allowed me to expect a child later this year. That is not currently calculated in any health technology assessment. And if I lived outside the United States, if I lived in Canada, if I lived in Australia, I would not have those gains. I would be dealing with a delay that is costly when it comes to progressive illness. That is what I would live with, right? And for me, I think it is fair to echo what Peter is saying, that I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the health technology assessment if and only if it can adequately value my life and the things that I have experienced. Right? 3 pills every single day for a few years have given me so much more than I was allowed to or benefiting from before them. That is the truth.
Any other questions?
Can I offer you an interesting story about meth? So the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, is a dispassionate organization, nonpartisan, that our government relies on to tell us what might we expect the savings to be or the cost to be of this law or that law. If there were ever an example of an independent organization that's asked to just do math, that's it. I suppose NASA as well, they do a lot of math too, and got to land probes on Mars and such. But they just estimated, recently what the impact of HR 3 would be on drugs, on the development of new drugs. How many fewer drugs might come to market if HR 3 came to pass? And you heard what we said today, that drug R&D would go to near zero. And yet what they said is 59 fewer drugs over 30 years. That's about 4%, 4.5% fewer drugs. And when you actually look through all their complicated math as to how they came to that conclusion, they made 2 types of mistakes. One mistake, if they had just fixed and noticed, would have made them realize that the number is closer to 260 by their math, 260 fewer drugs. And the other one would have made them realize that the answer is, they'd all be gone. And their error was to, kind of like NASA confused inches and centimeters once and caused a probe to hit the surface of the planet. Well, the CBO confused revenues and profits. They were referencing some esoteric economics paper somewhere that itself had that error. And it carried through the CBO's math. And so they just confused that shaving $900 billion off of what America would spend on branded drugs over 30 years, they treated it like it was revenues. But had they treated it like it was profits, and had they divided by their own number that they acknowledged each drug cost to bring to market, about $3.5 billion a year for each approved drug, they could have just divided 900 by 3.5 and they would have gotten to 257. They could have just checked their own math. So it's right there for anybody who has a really advanced economics degree and can understand what they wrote to realize why it's really disturbing when the government sets itself to doing some math and tells us how it's going to be. They're guessing as to what the market will do. But all they really had to ask themselves is there any example anywhere on Earth of investors investing in risky, intensive R&D when what's going to face them if they're successful enough to get a product to market is the reward of an uncertain, but definitely lower than now, government-dictated price? They were so focused on Congress's intent of how much Congress wanted to shave on R&D, they didn't even bother to question the nature of the tool that Congress was going to use. And it would have been really straightforward. Oh yeah, economics clearly tells us nobody invests in R&D when that's the way you reward them. Their report could have been so much simpler. So I would urge caution against relying on this kind of central math to dictate how our economy should work.
Any closing thoughts from our speakers? Well, on behalf of Incubate and everyone here today, I want to thank folks who have attended in person. While sitting there with my phone, I already saw some coverage beginning to pick up on this conversation, and that's fantastic to see, because we are not certain that this voice is being heard, that 59 lost drugs, which is inaccurate, is in any way acceptable, because we don't know what's in that 59, and we don't know what it might mean to a patient with a life-changing disease, and we all will be patients someday. And so I thank everyone for taking the time out of their day to cover this. We know this debate is front and center in Washington, And I hope folks leave with the takeaway that is what we started with, that investment from the early stage life science venture capital community will go to near zero if a policy like this moves forward. And we hope policymakers will hear your coverage and your commentary and respond accordingly. Thanks to our incredible speakers today, and thank you for being here together. Thanks.